is from Mexico. It is from the Colegio de Bachilleres Estado de Sinaloa in Guamuchil, in the state of Sinaloa in Mexico.
Good morning. Our times are now demanding changes in technology, and what are the demands for an educational institutions that is trying to change but has problems with implementing change because of the numerous variables that we need to take into account? What do you recommend?
Educational institutions have their own unique kind of problems and constraints, sometimes because they are run by government agencies and have to take into account the limitations of what that is in that circumstance to do. On the other hand, educational institutions, if and when everyone there realizes that they really need to be making a significant change, it's amazing in terms of kind of changes that they can make. Oftentimes, though, the administration of the organization says, we need to go in this particular direction. But the professors, the graduate assistants, and the staff don't fully understand the reason why such a large amount of change is necessary. And so they think they can just simply make a cosmetic change or two and not go fully into whatever kind of radical change is proposed. And so it's really bringing involved all of the faculty and staff into the process so that they fully understand the reason why such a large amount of change is necessary. Because frankly, they may be having to give up various kind of territories and powers that what traditional departments and organizations often have.
Thank you. We have another call from Mexico. This one is from the Universidad Tecnológica de Tecamachalco in the city of Tecamachalco in the state of Puebla in Mexico.
Thank you very much. Good morning. How would re-engineering process would help in a system of total quality?
Well, oftentimes when you implement total quality management, or how it's commonly called nowadays, Six Sigma, you often have a number of project teams that are focused on some very small kind of processes to improve distribution, or to improve administrative paperwork, or to reduce the amount of time it takes to manufacture something. And that's all well and good. However, they need to ask themselves the question on whether entire functions and tasks and responsibilities need to be done at all. I had a friend of mine in one company who was in charge of improving a particular computer system, and he realized at the beginning of the project the process didn't need to be improved, it needed to be eliminated entirely. There really wasn't a need for it at all.
Okay, we have another question coming in from Mexico. I don't know the location exactly yet, but let's see. Maybe the caller can tell us where she's calling, or he's calling from.
From Universidad del Valle. My question is how to relate the techniques mentioned before with a process, with an ISO 9000 process that our organization is now using.
ISO 9000 is an interesting animal in itself. And to be frank, I'm somewhat skeptical as to its usefulness. Oftentimes, oftentimes one's customers mandate that one has to be ISO 9000, or nowadays ISO 9000 2000 certified. And of course, if one customer requires it, one has to do it. But ISO 9000 can be a recipe for a tremendous amount of paperwork without a substantial increase in effectiveness. And I think that the organization has to take a thorough look as to whether ISO 9000 is really going to be serving their particular needs. And if it does not, don't implement it. or, if necessary, implement just those particular portions of it that they believe are useful and efficient and will help the profitability of the organization.
Thank you. And now from Peru, we have a call from La Universidad Ricardo Palma in the city of Lima in Peru.
Good morning. I am calling from Lima with the following question. How can we relate chaos theory to the strategies for change in an organization? And how can that influence the change in an organization?
If I understand the question correctly, one's theory of change, really speaking, really drives the entire change process. If one believes, for example, change that needs to go about is a lot of training of the organization, then naturally the only thing that one will do is train its employees. If, on the other hand, one has a larger systematic view of what needs to change in an organization, then one realizes that it's just not a lack of training that's a cause of various kind of change issues. It's a matter of consensus, it's a matter of technology, it's a matter of strategic direction, and it's a matter of having all the support systems around the organization supporting that particular change. And so one's theory of change does have a substantial effect in terms of what one is actually trying to do.
Thank you. And now from Mexico, from the Instituto Tecnológico de Estudios Superiores de la Región Carbonífera in the city of Sabinas in the state of Coahuila.
I think Mexico is ready for all the changes that you have just explained, in the sense that we are now part of the free trade agreement in North America. Are we really ready for those changes? And if not, what is your recommendation to us?
To some extent, it doesn't make a difference if you are ready for the change, because frankly, change is going to happen anyway. And so whether one likes the change, is ready for the change, is irrelevant. One has to deal with the change that is coming. For example, is the reduction in trade barriers in agricultural products, I know, has been a sore bone of contention between the United States and Mexico, even though NAFTA is in place. In addition, there is the issue of Mexican trucking about going into the United States has also been an issue that has gone back and forth quite a bit. One has to realize the change is coming, one has to anticipate it, one has to deal with it, and whether one likes it or not, you have the choice of either adapting to the change or withering away. And if people really understand that, people's sense of survival will hopefully be overcoming their resistance and their potential loss of prestige and power in the old system.
Our next question is from Peru. It is from, I believe, the Centro de Investigaciones Territoriales del Ecuador, CITE, in Quito, Peru.
Sorry, good morning. This is not from Peru, this is from Quito, Ecuador.
Sorry, from Quito, Ecuador.
Dr. Chaudron, I'd like to know if you say that to get a normal lexicon, to have the same word for the same things into the enterprise is a must, is the basic necessity. I'd like to know if what's your opinion on how to begin to form an enterprise from the very base? If we need to have the same vocabulary, the same lexicon, because this is going to be a matter of language or a matter of technique. And even though I'm speaking to you in English, thanks to God, and I don't know if among the languages, to break the language barrier, what could we do to get it? Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, por adelantado.
You know, the language and the culture issue is one of those things that to some extent it matters a lot, and to some extent it doesn't matter at all. I don't really even know if there is an objective way to determine if you and I are really understanding each other, given that my native language is English and that your native language, my guess would be Spanish. Ultimately, though, what it has to do with is a lot of conversation, a lot of interaction, and a lot of experience together. And I think if you combine the experience and the language and the training in terms of what needs to be done on an ongoing kind of basis, you're still going to have misunderstandings, to be frank. However, you will be getting closer and closer to what needs to be done. And that's what organizations need to do when they start from the base up, is to continue to have those kind of conversations. And so there is a greater sense of cohesion as far as the understanding of what actually needs to be achieved.
Thank you for your questions. Now let's move to the second module of our program.
All right, enough about the framework questions. During this module, I'd like to talk about the second, third, and fourth keys. The second key, assessment and measurement, is extremely important. As you have been told many times, what gets measured gets improved. I will need here to make a distinction between assessments and measurements, because organizations often use both, but they don't necessarily use them appropriately and at the right time. An assessment is the collection of data, events, perceptions, and the results of performance that is often done at the beginning or end of a process, and the evaluation of the data collected. Measurement, on the other hand, refers to the ongoing, recurring quantification of how well something is being accomplished. Examples of assessments include evaluations of management style, teamwork, organizational culture, market penetration, organizational strengths and weaknesses, comparisons of organizational processes with benchmarking data, and so on. As you can see in this particular example of an organization that I worked with, organization of work is the area of most concern to this particular group, and we did some team building with them in regards to this particular area of concern. Examples of measurements include things like goal attainment, financial performance, customer satisfaction, internal efficiency, and organizational and individual development, also known as the balanced scorecard, which we have often talked about in the past. The point to remember is this: to realize that both must be done. Organizations often conduct assessments but don't really evaluate if their measurement system is a good one. For example, they may assess the teamwork within a particular work group but don't reward teamwork on an ongoing basis. Assessment is not a substitute for ongoing measurement. Measurement alone is insufficient without evaluation and action to improve the measures of success. The third key is teamwork. Let me give you a couple of definitions of teamwork here. A more formal definition: it's a coordination of people, systems, and other resources in pursuit of a common goal. And a more practical one: the day-to-day activities that people do in working together. And a more practical one: the day-to-day activities people do to work together. In organizational change, teams may be formed to implement organizational change, run the business on a day-to-day basis, or solve technical issues. And to build these particular teams, organizations often don't use the right set of techniques, because what technique is best depends upon the extent and severity of the teamwork problems in organizations. If teamwork issues are only arising among a few teams, role clarification, goal clarification, or problem solving may be sufficient. However, if the teamwork issues are arising across the company, different techniques must be used. Significant process change, restructuring, tying pay to group and organizational performance may very well be necessary. The fourth key is training and learning. Of all the keys, this is the one most affected by technology and new methods of delivery, as for example, distance learning via the internet and satellite, just like what we've been doing here. The interesting part about it is that the technology may have changed, but people have not, and you still have to use a variety of methods and various sequences and a variety of technologies to fully get the point across and help people really learn. Common problems in developing and delivering training include the following. Sufficient needs analysis hasn't been done. The curriculum isn't sequenced properly. Standards are normative rather than competence-based. And course logistics don't conform to good training practices. In regards to need analysis, training is often used for non-training problems. Specific learning outcomes are not defined, and the training needed for job performance is not the training that's delivered. It's much too generic and much too broad. The curricular sequence may not be as good as it could be because there's insufficient understanding of entry behaviors. That is, management has not determined what people know when they first come to the classroom. The curriculum may not build into a sequence, but instead it's a scattered bunch of fragmentary activities that don't form a coherent whole. Oftentimes, training is normative rather than standards-based, so that the competence is defined as an average rather than as an aim for all students to achieve sufficient mastery to accomplish their job tasks. In regards to course logistics, good training may be developed, good people may be learning. Unfortunately, though, course logistics may be lacking. Oftentimes, organizations use what's called mass training. That is, they take large numbers of people, provide them with very superficial kind of training in such a way that it's a long time between when they receive the training and they use the training. As a result, people forget what they've learned in the classroom. Compare this to what's called the just-in-time training method. The just-in-time training method is where selected students go through very specific kinds of training, and this is done before, just before, the actual implementation and use. So, for example, let's say that you have the implementation of Six Sigma or Total Quality Management. Instead of training everyone in statistical techniques, it would be more appropriate and frankly better for the people involved for a project to be selected, the people assigned to the project, they receive the training that they need, and they go on and use that particular training. When another project comes along, then all they have to do is select that team, have them go through the training in a just-in-time sense, and then work on their project. This should be done instead of training everyone in statistical techniques, then expecting them to remembering and using it 6 months, 8 months, even a year later. It really is a recipe for poor retention if one uses the mass training kind of approach. In summary, these 4 keys, that is, the framework questions, assessment and measurement, teamwork, and training and learning, need to be used together and in unison for a successful organizational change to occur. Please also realize that for the most part, no one ever gets this right the first time. But it's very important to keep on trying and keep on improving what you do. And if you use these particular techniques, if you use this framework in terms of making implementation of organizational change happen, you will have a much higher chance of successfully achieving the outcomes that you desire and for your organization to be successful and whatever particular future comes about. Thank you very much.
Before we take questions from our audience, I would like to ask a few questions to Mr. Chaudron. You began to tell us a little bit about the frustration which led you to write your book, and then we began to take questions. So would you tell us a little bit more about your motivation and whether this frustration has now been alleviated now that you've written the book?
To some extent, it's made me actually even more frustrated because now I've kind of made clear, at least to myself anyway, in terms of what I think organizations need to achieve to really fully and successfully implement whatever kind of change they're putting about. To give an analogy is that what I often find a lot of organizations doing, and to be frank, a lot of consultants pushing, is this idea of training in a tool. And that if, for example, if you have a problem and someone says, here, this is a hammer, use this hammer. And then you use a screwdriver. Here, use a screwdriver. And here, this is an all. Use this all. And, you know, I sense the frustration of a lot of clients when this kind of approach is used. And I came to the realization is that the clients don't so much need a hammer, they don't need a nail, they don't need a screwdriver, they don't need an awl. They need a blueprint. But they need a blueprint that is not entirely canned. In other words, it's not something where they have to blindly go through step by step by step by step to do, but instead, it's a way of thinking and about going through a process so they can take all the learning that has been done by all the organizations around while still taking that and customizing it to their own particular and unique needs. Because a lot of organizations take a book and they say, oh, this is what they did at this company, we need to do the exact same thing, and they fall into that trap. Or on the other hand, what they do is they say, oh, well, we're just going to put some training in place on principles and concepts and don't tell people actually what they need to do. And that's the other problem. And so this I'm trying to chart in this book, I'm trying to chart a middle path so that one takes into account the learnings that other organizations have on one part while still taking into account the unique perspectives and situations that your own organization has.
For those of our viewers who would be interested in finding a copy of your book, where can they go to get that?
The easiest place to get it is at Amazon.com, and also if you're in Canada, Amazon.ca. And there are excerpts of the book on our website at organizedchange.com. They can look at the table of contents, at the preface and such, and get a better idea in terms of what's there.
You made a comment earlier about not being entirely certain that ISO 9000 is the best course or the total cure for this. Could you expand a little bit more on that for us?
Sure. Someone once told me is that ISO 9000 is the Europeans' revenge for all the management buzzwords that Americans have created in the last 30 or 40 years. As I said before, sometimes customers say, look, you have to have ISO 9000 to be a customer, to be a vendor of ours, and of course you have to implement it. But ISO 9000 can be, doesn't have to be, but can be a huge bureaucratic mess in terms of documentation and procedures and such, without a clear end goal as to why you're doing it and when you should be doing it. And frankly, at least in the United States, there's a tremendous percentage of companies that may not go from the old standard, which is ISO 9000, to the new standard, which is ISO 9000-2000, principally because of their questioning the usefulness of this. ISO 9000 isn't bad in and of itself, but again, one has to go through a thinking process about whether this is a good idea to be doing this.
Let's talk about TQM a little bit. TQM and ISO 9000 quality certification programs continue to expand in developing nations. Is this a buzzword that's society specific? Are these two, TQM and ISO 9000, do they relate better to the United States or to Europe or Latin America, let's say?
I think because TQM and its new incarnation, Six Sigma, focus very heavily on measuring results and measuring process. And the whole idea about something needs to be measured and improved, and that one should be making changes to make sure that those improvements happen, frankly, is very much of an American and to some extent a Western European perspective. It frankly is fairly a different perspective, perhaps, for many societies that they have to do. And so, in essence, to think that the idea of continually measuring something and continually improving something and continually putting time and effort into making sure the numbers are right is an American concept, but that frankly probably everyone has to apply if they're interested in improving themselves.
In addition to the concepts of TQM and ISO 9000, you've described in your presentation some intervention techniques which you've called keys. Are these equally applicable to countries within the United States as countries outside the United States? Again, let's talk about Latin America, because many of our viewers are from Latin America.
Sure. I think that they are entirely applicable at the high level that we're talking about here, where the nitty-gritty portions of it, really speaking, that really is where it has to be customized according to your current culture and issues. The idea of planning up front what you want to achieve and making, if necessary, mid-course corrections, however strange it may sound, probably plays better in more centrally planned economies and in more centrally controlled cultures than it does even in the United States, since the United States tends to be kind of flying by the seat of your pants kind of a culture, which frankly is not really that prevalent elsewhere. And so that particular portion of it may be even more relevant and easier to do outside the U.S.
Let's talk about different types of organizations, educational, government, and business. What are the special considerations that you believe should be taken into account for these intervention techniques or keys when dealing with an educational institution?
Sure. Educational institutions are kind of caught in the middle, if you will. Oftentimes they are publicly funded and have a limit in terms of what they can do on one hand. On the other hand, they see a very fast-changing marketplace, and they may not consider the students and the people around them to be a marketplace, but it is a marketplace. And there are changing technologies, there are changing environments, there are changing circumstances. And so on one hand, you have a very rapidly changing circumstance on one hand, but on the other hand, they may be severely constrained in terms of what they do. They have the additional issue of that their departments inside universities tend to be, using a business analogy, organizational silos. In other words, anthropology is taught here, engineering is taught here, computer science is taught here, astronomy is taught here. When frankly, probably the best approach to students is using a much more cross-functional kind of approach that may, if you look at it in an extreme sense, may require the disappearance of those functional departments and be more focused in terms of outcomes, in terms of jobs, areas of concern, and geography perhaps, instead of the traditional scientific disciplines and the way of organizing that educational institutions tend to be done that way.
How do the considerations change when you're dealing with a governmental entity or organization?
With governmental organizations, you have usually really two things. One of which is a civil service orientation. And so the kind of very strict, rigid rules that what civil service organizations tend to engender tend often to place a constraint in terms of what governments can actually achieve. There are reasons for those rules, of course, so the governments can't be doing arbitrary things to employees. But there was recently a large discussion in the United States in regards to the Department of Homeland Security, for example, because the people in government there wanted looser civil service rules to move people around, and there was a great deal of resistance from the civil service organizations because of that. And so that's kind of one constraining factor that businesses don't usually have. Businesses can hire and fire and change job descriptions much more easily than you can in government. And so that may be a longer path for governments to go through this because of that.
Well, and then let's talk about business organizations. In comparison to education, in comparison to government, you've talked about their additional flexibility in moving people around. Are there other considerations in using these keys